The Eric Mottram Memorial Conference. Indeed, our lunch today is a celebration. Will there ever be such another? In the first 2 weeks of 2016, the U.S. equity markets have dropped almost 10%, the worst New Year's start in history. In China, the world's biggest Ponzi scheme ever is rapidly unraveling. This time, the prognosis is much more ominous than in 2008. This, the worst and the most rapid economic deflation in all of human history. And what do the mass media have to say about it? The front pages and the TV screens have space and time for nothing but an endless elegy of a pop star. What of the 21st century thus far? The Institute of United States Studies, Howell Daniels and Eric Mottram's pride and joy, was dismembered and absorbed a dozen years ago. Today, in Britain and America, how many teachers in the humanities and the liberal arts colleges have secure jobs? How many have already bit the dust? We all, I'm sure, have friends and associates who may well be going to food banks. Even before the economic collapse, the destruction had been continuing apace. A large digital archive of the work of the great Belgian composer Henri Pousseur, with whom I worked closely and whose obituary I wrote for The Guardian half a dozen years ago, was housed at the Lansdowne Center at Middlesex University. Last week, when I tried to access it online, I discovered that the entire center had disappeared, and online access to Henri's archive had disappeared along with it. God knows what's become of the archive. Now, in my own experience, buried in the sands of time, I mean really far back, there was Stockton College in California, which was the remarkable, locally supported, free public junior college where I started my higher education. Today, it is dumbed down and dismembered. In fact, the whole city of Stockton is officially bankrupt. But back in 1948, that was where my real education began. My freshman English textbook was called Patterns for Living. That was it, in 2 volumes. 1,300 hefty pages of small print with categorically arranged selections from essays, poetry, fiction, biography, and drama. The authors included Arnold Bennett, Mark Twain, Marcel Proust, Joseph Conrad, John Keats, A.E. Housman, Andrew Marvell, Archibald MacLeish, Willa Cather, Robert Herrick, and that is just a handful selected at random from the first page of a 10-page table of contents. One of the essays in it caught my eye. Milton S. Mayer's Socrates Crosses the Delaware. Milton Mayer was a Jewish journalist and professor who went to Germany after World War II, selecting and interviewing in depth 10 active Nazis whom he came to call his friends. The result was a remarkable book called, with a wonderful title, They Thought They Were Free. His essay in this book, in Patterns of Living, is the remarkable story of how an unremarkable college, St. John's in Annapolis, Maryland, lost its accreditation and then redeemed itself by becoming a liberal arts college dedicated to the examination in depth of a curriculum of great books in many languages from many centuries, ranging across the arts and the sciences. Now, there at Stockton College was a professor whose remarkable year-long sophomore class called World Literature and Art was like an encapsulation of the St. John's curriculum. He was Irving Goldman, a sad, hollow-eyed Jew who carried the weight of the world on his stooped shoulders. He had been to the edge of the abyss and stared down into it. What he saw, he found to be so horrifying, but at the same time so avoidable that he was driven to impart his vision to his students, even from the occasional depths of depression, in which he had been known to lie on his back atop his desk, delivering his lecture from this funereal position. May I interject at this point that we who knew Eric Mottram closely were aware that his private moods could be rather darker than his public persona. Professor Goldman seemed to care for nothing except knowledge and the sharing of it. There was never time enough to impart it all. He organized all of human activity along great temporal arcs on the blackboard, in which civilizations began in primitive simplicity, ascended towards classical rationality, and then declined into romantic decadence. Everything seemed to fit somehow into these schemes, whether they were applied to ancient Greece, Western Europe, or the cultural history of China or India. Like the massive cyclical structures of Spengler and Toynbee, they provided an assurance of order, a guarantee that we were living in a rational, if indifferent, universe. And the greatest lesson of all, which he wrote on the blackboard every beginning of every lesson, from Terence: Homo sum humani nihil me alienum puto. I'm a human being. I consider nothing that is human to be alien to me. But it was always evident that Professor Goldman's enlightenment had come at a price. It shone forth in the heartfelt intensity with which he presented the Aristotelian theory of tragedy. A student recalls an episode in which he disappeared for about a week and was found in San Francisco with amnesia. Fortunately, he just happened to be recognized by a woman living in the city who was a former student and was the sister of a Stockton resident. I was only one of the many students to value him so highly. Dave Brubeck was a few years ahead of me at Stockton College. In his notes to his composition, Wilderness, he wrote, "I am not affiliated with any church. 3 Jewish teachers have been a great influence on my life: Irving Goldman, Darius Milhaud, and Jesus. I'm a product of Judaic Christian thinking, without the complications of theological doctrine. I wanted to understand what I had inherited in this world, both the problems and the answers from that cultural heritage, and note the order in which Brubeck had named them. Goldman at the top. Now, Professor Goldman had an acquaintance whom he declared to be even more brilliant than he was. After effortlessly taking a PhD in philosophy, this intellectual paragon set about writing down everything that he had learned. Known languages, of which he had mastered several, both ancient and modern, proved insufficient for the task, and so he invented his own, encoded in a 3-line notation consisting of a tripartite staff of cursive, oriental-looking scripts. I once had a little scrap of it that Eric Goldman gave me. It was about 4 by 6 inches. It consisted of a thick line as of uppercase letters, which was paralleled above and below with narrower, more dense lines, resulting in a complex, multi-layered calligraphy that was even more incomprehensible than Eric's. The learned scholar turned out reams of this tantalizing script. All day and all night he did nothing except eat, sleep, write, and relieve himself in a corner of his padded cell. Solitary confinement had become necessary after he realized that he was God. Thenceforth, anyone who disagreed with him over the slightest thing was declared anathema and sentenced to summary execution. his few visitors communicated with him from a respectful distance. Now, both of these formidable intellects had dedicated themselves to the preservation and the propagation of the truth as they had discovered and encapsulated it. They had no apparent ulterior motive other than perhaps a variant of that power pleasure which comes in a widely destructive form to those who seek to seize control of others through politics, finance, or warfare. For these two noble minds, fulfillment lay in the hope that their insights would somehow survive them. And so, as I reached my 85th birthday, I asked myself, what is the ultimate price of enlightenment? Perhaps Max Beerbohm was the wisest of us all. At the end of his BBC talk in 1942, Music Halls of My Youth, he wrote, "I am inclined to think, indeed I have always thought, that a young man who desires to know all that in all ages and all lands has been thought by the best minds and wishes to make a synthesis of all of those thoughts for the future benefit of mankind is laying up for himself a very miserable old age." And he concluded, "Good night, children," everywhere. Years later, word reached me that Professor Goldman had killed himself. Thus far, I've resisted the temptation. Thank you for your indulgence. Now that's out of the way. I can open the curtains and get on with the jollities of cuisine.
Yeah,